Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Russ Preston. We're going to get started. We've got a really interesting set of talks to give you today. But just for introduction, I want to thank our anonymous donor for the lunch. He knows who he is. So this was really generously provided for us to make sure everyone came to this session. So anyways, we're here to talk about the project for the Next American Urbanism. And just for a quick introduction, I run a company called Principal Group. We do a lot of placemaking and planning, mostly around the city of Boston. But foremost, I've been involved with this organization for over 10 years and really excited about where we're at right now as far as seeing it as a movement as well as the organization. And I think that has a lot to do with this demographic wave that we're all experiencing, with people moving back into the cities. So we've talked about that a lot last night. We've heard about it over the last few years. But a lot of what we're going to present today is a reaction to that. So a couple trends, though, before we get started that we need to pay attention to is that, a big thing that we're noticing is sort of we've lumped into the lack of productivity that sort of our environment has created for us. This is both health as well as vibrancy. This idea that density isn't necessarily the solution, and we're building this sort of placelessness into these cities. We have to be cautious of that. And then this is in my hometown, Boston, this idea of chunky development, this idea that we're not really paying attention to the fine-grained details that really make places elegant for people. And this is happening in other cities too. This is New York. So we're starting to see these trends happen and affect the cities in much more impactful ways than we have in the past. So after the recession in 2010, I invited some friends and some smarter people than I down to New Orleans to start to talk about what are these trends doing to new urbanism, and what do we do to sort of combat them. And to a certain extent, so we met in New Orleans for 4 or 5 days, and just kind of talked about this and began this discussion. A year later, we met in South Beach in Steve Mouzon's office for a couple days and continued the discussion. And really, at this point in time, this idea of this grand idea around the continental development model emerged, this idea of the Next American Urbanism. And then last year, we met in Louisville. And we picked Louisville because it represented a lot of the trends we were seeing, and a lot of these ideas were actually on the ground, actually being worked on. So in Louisville, we really wrapped this together, and some clear platforms started to emerge. And it came around this question: is what's next? What are we doing next? And I think it's a really compelling question to think about at this point in time with CMU. But for us, it's about we need to make more places that are remarkable. It's a competitive thing that we're dealing with at a global scale. And I always reference that, there's very few cities in America that end up on the most livable city indexes. And I think that's a shame. And then for me, it's always about the 4-year-old. How can they get around, their neighborhood? And can we make our places more livable? And this is sort of another idea that this natural beauty can exist both in the countryside as well as in our denser cities. So the project is composed of sort of these elements. We're kind of at the value stage. What are we really talking about? And we wanted to share those thoughts with you today. But really, this is meant to be a conversation and a starting point that we hope over the next couple of years we can really bring to fruition. And this has already started. So what emerged out of that first meeting in New Orleans was this brand, for lack of a better term, of tactical urbanism. It was these patterns we were seeing that were kind of infectious in cities across the country. And this has taken off since 2010 and really become a radical thing that for cities and planning departments to use to disrupt change in the way that we're building out our cities. So we'll talk more about that. But just sort of pulling back from tactical urbanism, we've started to see these 7 platforms of how we should be practicing as urbanists in doing our work both in the countryside as well as the big cities. And each of our speakers today are going to hit on those points. But just to summarize quickly, the first one is, we design places around people. This is we're seeing transportation departments and planning departments start to focus on people first, and this is a really important trend. The second one is this idea of lifestyle, and Ed Erfurt will talk to that a little bit. And that the health of our society is directly linked to the well-being of the citizens. We need to actually talk about how we do that across a full spectrum. And then this idea of citicism. This is an old word that sort of labels, it's reemerging as we see tactical urbanism being used by everyday advocates and residents of their neighborhood. Then this idea of value, that we can actually capture value for urbanism, and it can actually create a virtuous cycle of reinvestment. And that we need to actually think about that in a much more meaningful and impactful way, and use it as a tool. And then that, we talk a lot about how some places are going to win, some are going to lose, but this idea that we have to have a way to measure investment-ready places and focus our investments in critical areas around transit, around walkability, and such. And then, we've talked a lot about lean in the last couple of years. There's a lot going on in this Congress about lean, and we've pulled back from that and started thinking about the agile methods and the actual practice of being lean. And this is a really important point that we'll get to later. And then, most importantly for me, is this idea that we're building authentically, that we're actually building places that have meaningful characteristics that people grow and end up loving, and that connections are made in the public spaces of our cities. So this is the campaign for urbanism. This is, we're thinking about this as a much larger initiative with CNU that is more outward-looking and bringing more infectious for the outside world. And it's really about this change, this shift in thinking between what is the American dream now. And for a lot of my colleagues, it's the image on the left. And I think we have to acknowledge that and start to build tools that are at a visionary level at the continental scale. And we've done this before in America. This is the GI Bill. This is the grid that spans the western half of our country. These grand continental ideas have driven development in our country for much of its existence. And we've started thinking about this as, the suburbs aren't over. It's just we're starting to recolonize our continent again. And we start to think about how we can create not play in the same sandbox we've been playing in, but start to think about new ways of directing that development. So for us, we've moved beyond sprawl in our thinking, and we're very much about how do we affect all of these places across the full spectrum of the urban environment. Because the cities aren't dead; they're just assets that we haven't reawakened yet. And we're really interested in and this is happening now. These projects are ongoing. This is the Memphis On Tap Brewery project that just happened a couple weeks ago. So we have to start to rethink how we actually practice as urbanists in these cities, and this is the beginning of that discussion today.